Class 10, Part 3rd, Modern History, Theme 10, Colonialism and the Countryside. In this chapter, you will see what colonial rule meant to those who lived in the countryside. You will meet the Zamindars of Bengal, travel to the Rajmahal Hills where the Paharias and the Santals lived, and then move west to the Deccan. You will look at the way the English East India Company (EIC) established its Raj in the countryside, implemented its revenue policies, what these policies meant to different sections of people, and how they changed everyday lives. Laws introduced by the state have consequences for people. They determine to an extent who grows richer and who poorer, who acquires new land and who loses the lands they have lived on, where peasants go when they need money. As you will see, however, people were not only subject to the working of laws, they also resisted the law by acting according to what they believed to be just. In doing so, people defined the way in which laws operated, thereby modifying their consequences. You will also come to know about the sources that tell us about these histories and the problems historians face in interpreting them. You will read about revenue records and surveys, journals and accounts left by surveyors and travelers, and reports produced by inquiry commissions. 1. Bengal and the Zamindars. As you know, colonial rule was first established in Bengal. It is here that the earliest attempts were made to reorder rural society and establish a new regime of land rights and a new revenue system. Let us see what happened in Bengal in the early years of Company EIC rule. 1.1. An auction in Burdwan. In 1797, there was an auction in Burdwan, present-day Bardhaman. It was a big public event. A number of mahals, estates held by the Raja of Burdwan were being sold. The permanent settlement had come into operation in 1793. The East India Company had fixed the revenue that each zamindar had to pay. The estates of those who failed to pay were to be auctioned to recover the revenue. Since the Raja had accumulated huge areas, his estates had been put up for auction. Numerous purchasers came to the auction and the estates were sold to the highest bidder. But the collectors soon discovered a strange twist to the tale. Many of the purchasers turned out to be the servants and agents of the Raja, who had bought the lands on behalf of their master. Over 95% of the sale at the auction was fictitious. The Raja's estate had been publicly sold, but he remained in control of his zamindari. Why had the Raja failed to pay the revenue? Who were the purchasers at the auction? What does the story tell us about what was happening in the rural areas of eastern India at that time? 1.2. The problem of unpaid revenue. The estates of the Burdwan Raj were not the only ones sold during the closing years of the 18th century. Over 75% of the zamindaris changed hands after the permanent settlement. In introducing the permanent settlement, British officials hoped to resolve the problems they had been facing since the conquest of Bengal. By the 1770s, the rural economy in Bengal was in crisis, with recurrent famines and declining agricultural output. Officials felt that agriculture, trade, and the revenue resources of the state could all be developed by encouraging investment in agriculture. This could be done by securing rights of property and permanently fixing the rates of revenue demand. If the revenue demand of the state was permanently fixed, then the company could look forward to a regular flow of revenue, while entrepreneurs could feel sure of earning a profit from their investment, since the state would not siphon it off by increasing its claim. The process officials hoped would lead to the emergence of class of yeoman farmers and rich landowners who would have the capital and enterprise to improve agriculture. Nurtured by the British, this class would also be loyal to the company. The problem, however, lay in identifying individuals who could both improve agriculture and contract to pay the fixed revenue to the state. After a prolonged debate amongst company officials, the permanent settlement was made with the Rajas and Talukdars of Bengal. They were now classified as zamindars and they had to pay the revenue demand that was fixed in perpetuity. In terms of this definition, the zamindar was not a landowner in the village but a revenue collector of the state. Zamindars had several, sometimes as many as 400, villages under them. In company calculations, the villages within one zamindari formed one revenue state. The company fixed the total demand over the entire state whose revenue the zamindar contracted to pay. The zamindar collected rent from the different villages, paid the revenue to the company and retained the difference as his income. He was expected to pay the company regularly, failing which his estate could be auctioned. 1.3. Why zamindars defaulted on payments? Company officials felt that a fixed revenue demand would give zamindars a sense of security and assured of returns on their investment, encouraged them to improve their estates. In the early decades after the permanent settlement, however, zamindars regularly failed to pay the revenue demand and unpaid balances accumulated. The reasons for this failure were various. First, the initial demands were very high. This was because it was felt that if the demand was fixed for all time to come, the company would never to be able to claim a share of increased income from land when prices rose and cultivation expanded. To minimize this anticipated loss, the company pegged the revenue demand high, arguing that the burden on zamindars would gradually decline as agricultural production expanded and prices rose. Second, this high demand was imposed in the 1790s, a time when the prices of agricultural produce were depressed, making it difficult for the ryots to pay their dues to the zamindar. If the zamindar could not collect the rent, how could he pay the company? Third, the revenue was invariable, regardless of the harvest, and had to be paid punctually. In fact, according to the sunset law, if payment did not come in by sunset of the specified date, the zamindari was liable to be auctioned. Fourth, the permanent settlement initially limited the power of zamindar to collect rent from the ryot and manage his zamindari. The company had recognized the zamindars as important, but it wanted to control and regulate them, subdue their authority and restrict their autonomy. The zamindars' troop were disbanded, custom duties abolished, and their kachharis, courts, brought under the supervision of a collector appointed by the company. Zamindars lost their power to organize local justice and the local police. Over time, the collectorate emerged as an alternative center of authority, severely restricting what the zamindar could do. In one case, when a Raja failed to pay the revenue, a company official was speedily dispatched to his zamindari with explicit instructions to take charge of the district and to use the most effectual means to destroy all the influence and the authority of the Raja and his officers. At the time of rent collection, an officer of the zamindar, usually the amla, came around to the village, but rent collection was a perennial problem. Sometimes bad harvest and low prices made payment of dues difficult for the ryots. At other times, ryots deliberately delayed payment. Rich ryots and village headmen, jotedars and mandals were only too happy to see the zamindar in trouble. The zamindar could therefore not easily assert his power over them. Zamindars could persecute defaulters, but the judicial process was long drawn. In Bardhaman alone, there were over 30,000 pending suits for areas of rent payment. 1.4. The rise of the jotedars. While many zamindars were facing a crisis at the end of the 18th century, a group of rich peasants were consolidating their position in the villages. In Francis Buchanan's survey of the Dinajpur district in North Bengal, we have a vivid description of this class of rich peasants known as Jotedars. By the early 19th century, Jotedars had acquired vast areas of land, sometimes as much as several thousand acres. They controlled local trade as well as money lending, exercising immense power over the poorer cultivators of the region. A large part of their land was cultivated through sharecroppers, adhyars or bargadars, who brought their own plugs, labored in the field, and handed over half the produce to the jotedars after the harvest. Within the villages, the power of jotedars was more effective than that of zamindars. Unlike zamindars, who often lived in urban areas, jotedars are located in the villages and exercise direct control over considerable section of poor villagers. They fiercely resisted efforts by zamindars to increase the jama of the village, prevented zamindari officials from executing their duties, mobilized riots who were dependent on them, and deliberately delayed payments of revenue to the zamindar. In fact, when the estates of the zamindars were auctioned for failure to make revenue payment, jotedars were often amongst the purchasers. The jotedars were most powerful in North Bengal, although rich peasants and village headmen were emerging as commanding figures in the countryside in other parts of Bengal as well. In some places they were called havaldars, elsewhere they were known as gatidars or mandals. Their rise inevitably weakened zamindari authority. 1.5. The zamindars resist. The authority of the zamindars in rural areas, however, did not collapse. Faced with an exorbitantly high revenue demand and possible auction of their estates, they devised ways of surviving the pressures. New contexts produced new strategies. Fictitious sale was one such strategy. It involved a series of maneuvers. The Raja of Bardhaman, for instance, first transferred some of his jamindari to his mother, since the company had decreed that the property of women would not be taken over. Then, as a second move, his agents manipulated the auctions. The revenue demand of the company was deliberately withheld and unpaid balances were allowed to accumulate. When a part of the state was auctioned, the zamindar's men bought property, outbidding other purchasers. Subsequently, they refused to pay up the purchase money, so that the state had to be resold. Once again, it was bought by the zamindar's agent. Once again, the purchase money was not paid, and once again, there was an auction. This process was repeated endlessly, exhausting the state and the other bidders at the auction. At last, the state was sold at a low price back to the zamindar. Page number 262. Source 1. The Jotedars of Dinajpur. Buchanan described the ways in which the Jotedars of Dinajpur in North Bengal resisted being disciplined by the zamindar and undermined his power. Landlords do not like this class of men, but it is evident that they are absolutely necessary, unless the landlords themselves would advance money to their necessitous tenantry. The jotedars who cultivate large portions of lands are very refractory and know that the zamindars have no power over them. They pay only a few rupees on account of their revenue and then fall in balance almost every kist installment. They hold more lands than they are entitled to by their potas. Dates of contract. Should the zamindar's officers in consequence summon them to the kachari and detain them for 1 or 2 hours with a view to reprimand them, they immediately go and complain at the Fauzdari Thana, police station, for imprisonment at the Munsifs, a judicial officer at the lower court, Kachari, for being dishonored, and whilst the causes continue unsettled, they instigate the petty riots not to pay their revenue consequently. The zamindar never paid the full revenue demand. The company rarely recovered the unpaid balances that had piled up. Such transactions happened on a grand scale. Between 1793 and 1801, four big zamindars of Bengal, including Burdwan, made Benami purchases that collectively yielded as much as rupees 30 lakh. Of the total sales of the auctions, over 15% were fictitious. There were other ways in which zamindars circumvented displacement. When people from outside the zamindari bought an estate at an auction, they could not always take possession. At times, their agents would be attacked by lathyals of the former zamindars. Sometimes, even the ryots resisted the entry of outsiders. They felt bound to their own zamindar through a sense of loyalty and perceived him as a figure of authority and themselves as his praja, subjects. The sale of the zamindari disturbed their sense of identity, their pride. The zamindars therefore were not easily displaced. By the beginning of the 19th century, the depression in prices was over. Thus, those who had survived the troubles of the 1790s consolidated their power. Rules of revenue payment were also made somewhat flexible. As a result, the zamindar's power over the villages was strengthened. It was only during the Great Depression of the 1930s that they finally collapsed and the jotedars consolidated their power in the countryside. 1.6 The Fifth Report. Many of the changes we are discussing were documented in detail in a report that was submitted to the British Parliament in 1813. It was the fifth of a series of reports on the administration and activities of the East India Company in India. Often referred to as the Fifth Report, it ran into 1002 pages, of which over 800 pages were appendices that produced petitions of zamindars and ryots. Reports of collections from different districts, statistical tables on revenue returns, and notes on the revenue and judicial administration of Bengal and Madras. Present-day Tamil Nadu, written by officials. From the time the company established its rule in Bengal in the mid-1760s, its activities were closely watched and debated in England. There were many groups in Britain who were opposed to the monopoly that the East India Company had over trade with India and China. These groups wanted a revocation of the royal charter that gave the company this monopoly. An increasing number of private traders wanted a share in the India trade, and the industrialists of Britain were keen to open up the Indian market for British manufacturers. Many political groups argued that the conquest of Bengal was benefiting only the East India Company but not the British nation as a whole. Information about company misrule and maladministration was hotly debated in Britain, and incidents of the greed and corruption of company officials were widely publicized in the press. The British Parliament passed a series of acts in the late 18th century to regulate and control company rule in India. It forced the company to produce regular reports on the administration of India and appointed committees to inquire into the affairs of the company. The Fifth Report was one such report produced by a select committee. It became the basis of intense parliamentary debates on the nature of the East India Company's rule in India. For over a century and a half, the Fifth Report has shaped our conception of what happened in rural Bengal in the late 18th century. The evidence contained in the Fifth Report is invaluable, but official reports like this have to be read carefully. We need to know who wrote the reports and why they were written. In fact, recent researches show that the arguments and evidence offered by the Fifth Report cannot be accepted uncritically. Researchers have carefully examined the archives of various Bengal zamindars and the local records of the districts to write about the history of colonial rule in rural Bengal. They indicate that, intent on criticizing the maladministration of the company, the Fifth Report exaggerated the collapse of traditional zamindari power as also overestimated the scale on which zamindars were losing their land. As we have seen, Even when zamindaris were auctioned, zamindars were not always displaced given the ingenious method they used to retain their zamindaris. Page number 265, source 2, from the fifth report. Referring to the condition of zamindars and the auction of lands, the fifth report stated, the revenue was not realized with punctuality and lands to a considerable extent were periodically exposed to sale by auction. In the native year 1203, corresponding with 1796 to 97, the land advertised for sale comprehended a jumma or assessment of Sikka rupees 28,70,061. The extent of land actually sold bore a jumma or assessment of 14,18,756 and the amount of purchase money Sikka rupees 17,90,416. In 1204, corresponding with 1797 to 98, the land advertised was for Sikka rupees 26,66,191. The quantity sold was for Sikka rupees 22,74,076 and the purchase money Sikka rupees 21,47,580. Among the defaulters were some of the oldest families of the country. Such were the Rajas of Nudia, Rajashai, Bishanpur, all districts of Bengal, and others, the dismemberment of whose estates at the end of each succeeding year threatened them with poverty and ruin, and in some instances presented difficulties to the revenue officers in their efforts to preserve undiminished the amount of public assessment. 2. The hoe and the plug. Let us now shift our focus from the wetlands of Bengal to drier zones, from a region of settled cultivation to one where shifting agriculture was practiced. You will see the changes that came about when the frontiers of the peasant economy expanded outwards, swallowing up pastures and forests in the Rajmahal hills. You will also see how these changes created a variety of conflicts within the region. 2.1 In the hills of Rajmahal. In the early 19th century, Buchanan travelled through the Rajmahal hills. From his description, the hills appeared impenetrable, a zone where very few travellers ventured, an area that signified danger. Wherever he went, people were hostile, apprehensive of officials, and unwilling to talk to them. In many instances, they deserted their villages and absconded. Who were these hill folk? Why were they so apprehensive of Buchanan's visit? Buchanan's journal gives us tantalizing glimpses of these hill folk in the early 19th century. His journal was written as a diary of places he visited, people he encountered, and practices he saw. It raises questions in our mind but does not always help us answer them. It tells us about a moment in time but not about the longer history of people and places. For that, historians have to turn to other records. If we look at the late 18th century revenue records, we learn that these hill folk were known as Pahadias. They lived around the Rajmahal hills, subsisting on forest produce and practicing shifting cultivation. They cleared patches of forest by cutting bushes and burning the undergrowth. On these patches, enriched by the potash from the ash, the Pahadias grew a variety of pulses and millets for consumption. They scratched the ground lightly with hoes, cultivated the cleared land for a few years, then left it fallow so that it could recover its fertility and move to a new area. From the forests, they collected mahua, a flower for food, silk cocoons and resin for cell, and wood for charcoal production. The undergrowth that spread like a mat below the trees and the patches of grass that covered the lands left fallow provided pasture for cattle. Page number 266. Who was Buchanan? Francis Buchanan was a physician who came to India and served in the Bengal Medical Service from 1794 to 1815. For a few years, he was surgeon to the Governor General of India, Lord Wellesley. During his stay in Calcutta, present-day Kolkata, he organized a zoo that became the Calcutta Elephant Zoo. He was also in charge of the botanical gardens for a short period. On the request of the government of Bengal, he undertook detailed surveys of the areas under the jurisdiction of the British East India Company. In 1815, he fell ill and returned to England. Upon his mother's death, he inherited her property and assumed her family name Hamilton. So, he is often called Buchanan Hamilton. The life of the Paharias as hunters, shifting cultivators, food gatherers, charcoal producers, silkworm rearers was thus intimately connected to the forest. They lived in herdments within tamarind groves and rested in the shade of mango tree. They considered the entire region as their land, their basis of their identity as well as survival, and they resisted the intrusion of outsiders. Their chiefs maintained the unity of the group, settled disputes, and led the tribe in battles with other tribes and plains people. With their base in the hills, the Paharias regularly raided the plains where settled agriculturists lived. These raids were necessary for survival, particularly in years of scarcity. They were a way of asserting power over settled communities, and they were a means of negotiating political relations with outsiders. The zamindars on the plains had to often purchase peace by paying a regular tribute to the hill chiefs. Traders similarly gave a small amount to the hill folk for permission to use the passes controlled by them. Once the toll was paid, the Pahadia chiefs protected the traders, ensuring that their goods were not plundered by anyone. This negotiated peace was somewhat fragile. It broke down in the last decades of the 18th century when the frontiers of settled agriculture were being aggressively extended in eastern India. The British encouraged forest clearance, and the zamindars and jotedars turned uncultivated lands into rice fields. To the British, extension of settled agriculture was necessary to enlarge the sources of land revenue, produce crops for export, and establish the basis of a settled, ordered society. They also associated forest with wildness and saw forest people as savage, unruly, primitive, and difficult to govern. So they felt that forest had to be cleared, settled agriculture established, and forest people tamed, civilized and persuaded to give up hunting and take to plug agriculture. As settled agriculture expanded, the area under forest and pastures contracted. This sharpened the conflict between hill folk and settled cultivators. The former began to raid settled villages with increasing regularity, carrying away food grains and cattle. Exasperated colonial officials tried desperately to control and subdue the Paharias, but they found the task difficult. In the 1770s, the British embarked on a brutal policy of extermination, hunting the Paharias down and killing them. Then, by the 1780s, Augustus Cleveland, the collector of Bhagalpur, proposed a policy of pacification. Pahadia chiefs were given an annual allowance and made responsible for the proper conduct of their men. They were expected to maintain order in their localities and discipline their own people. Many Pahadia chiefs refused the allowances. Those who accepted most often lost authority within the community. Being in the pay of the colonial government, they came to be perceived as subordinate employees or stipendiary chiefs. As the pacification campaigns continued, the Paharias withdrew deep into the mountains, insulating themselves from hostile forces and carrying on a war with outsiders. So, when Buchanan travelled through the region in the winter of 1810-11, the Paharias naturally viewed him with suspicion and distrust. The experience of pacification campaigns and memories of brutal repression shaped their perception of British infiltration into the area. Every white man appeared to represent a power that was destroying their way of life and means of survival, snatching away their control over their forests and lands. By this time, in fact, there were newer intimations of dangers. Santhals were pouring into the area, clearing forests, cutting down timber, plugging land, and growing rice and cotton. As the lower hills were taken over by Santhal settlers, the Paharias receded deeper into the Rajmahal hills. If Paharia life was symbolized by the hoe, which they used for shifting cultivation, the settlers came to represent the power of the plug. The battle between the hoe and the plug was a long one. 2.2 The Santhals, pioneer settlers. At the end of 1810, Buchanan crossed Ganjuria Pahad, which was part of the Rajmahal ranges, passed through the rocky country beyond, and reached a village. It was an old village, but the land around had been recently cleared to extend cultivation. Looking at the landscape, Buchanan found evidence of the region having been transformed through proper application of human labor. He wrote, Gunjuria is just sufficiently cultivated to show that a glorious country this might be made. I think its beauty and riches might be made equal to almost any in the universe. The soil here was rocky but uncommonly fine, and nowhere had Buchanan seen finer tobacco and mustard. On inquiry, he discovered that the frontiers of cultivation there had been extended by the Santhals. They had moved into this area around 1800, displaced the hill folk who lived on these lower slopes, cleared the forest, and settled the land. How did the Santhals reach the Rajmahal hills? The Santhals had begun to come into Bengal around the 1780s. Zamindars hired them to reclaim the land and expand cultivation, and British officials invited them to settle in the jungle mahals. Having failed to subdue the Paharias and transform them into settled agriculturists, the British turned to the Santhals. The Paharias refused to cut forest, resisted touching the plug, and continued to be turbulent. The Santhals, by contrast, appeared to be ideal settlers, clearing forests and plugging the land with vigor. The Santhals were given land and persuaded to settle in the foothills of Rajmahal. By 1832, a large area of land was demarcated as Damine Kho. This was declared to be the land of the Santhals. They were to live within it, practice plug agriculture, and become settled peasants. The land grant to the Santhals stipulated that at least 1/10 of the area was to be cleared and cultivated within the first 10 years. The territory was surveyed and mapped. Enclosed with boundary pillars, it was separated from both the world of the settled agriculturists of the plains and the Paharias of the hills. After the demarcation of Damine Kho, Santhal settlements expanded rapidly. From 40 Santhal villages in the area in 1838, as many as 1,473 villages had come up by 1851. Over the same period, the Santhal population increased from a mere 3,000 to over 82,000. As cultivation expanded, an increased volume of revenue flowed into the company's coffers. Santhal myths and songs of the 19th century refer very frequently to a long history of travel. They represent the Santhal past as one of the continuous mobility, a tireless search for a place to settle. Here in the Damine Kho, their journey seemed to have come to an end. When the Santhal settled on the peripheries of the Rajmahal hills, the Paharias resisted but were ultimately forced to withdraw deeper into the hills. Restricted from moving down to the lower hills and valleys, they were confined to the dry interior and to the more barren and rocky upper hills. This severely affected their lives, impoverishing them in the long term. Shifting agriculture depended on the ability to move to newer and newer land and utilization of the natural fertility of the soil. When the most fertile soils became inaccessible to them, being part of the Daman, the Pahadias could not effectively sustain their mode of cultivation. When the forests of the region were cleared for cultivation, the hunters amongst them also faced problems. The Santals, by contrast, gave up their earlier life of mobility and settled down, cultivating a range of commercial crops for the market and dealing with traders and moneylenders. The Santals, however, soon found that the land they had brought under cultivation was slipping away from their hands. The state was levying heavy taxes on the land that the Santals had cleared. Moneylenders, the Kus, were charging them high rates of interest and taking over the land when debts remained unpaid, and zamindars were asserting control over the Daman area. By the 1850s, the Santals felt that the time had come to rebel against zamindars, moneylenders, and the colonial state in order to create an ideal world for themselves where they would rule. It was after the Santhal Revolt 1855 to 1856 that the Santhal Pargana was created, carving out 5,500 square miles from the districts of Bhagalpur and Birbhum. The colonial state hoped that by creating a new territory for the Santhals and imposing some special laws within it, the Santhals could be conciliated. 2.3 The Counts of Buchanan. We have been drawing on Buchanan's account, but while reading his reports, we should not forget that he was an employee of the British East India Company. His journeys were not simply inspired by the love of landscape and the desire to discover the unknown. He marched everywhere with a large army of people, draughtsmen, surveyors, palanquin bearers, coolies. The cost of the travels were borne by the East India Company since it needed the information that Buchanan was expected to collect. Buchanan had specific instructions about what he had to look for and what he had to record. When he arrived at a village with his army of people, he was immediately perceived as an agent of the Sarkar. As the company consolidated its power and expanded its commerce, it looked for natural resources it could control and exploit. It surveyed landscapes and revenue sources, organized voyages of discovery, and sent its geologists and geographers, its botanists and medical men to collect information. Buchanan, undoubtedly an extraordinary observer, was one such individual. Everywhere Buchanan went, he obsessively observed the stones and rocks and the different strata and layers of the soil. He searched for minerals and stones that were commercially valuable. He recorded all signs of iron ore and mica, granite and saltpeter. He carefully observed local practices of salt making and iron ore mining. When Buchanan wrote about a landscape, he most often described not just what he saw, what the landscape was like, but also how it could be transformed and made more productive. What crops could be cultivated, which trees cut down, and which ones grown. And we must remember that his vision and his priorities were different from those of the local inhabitants. His assessment of what was necessary was shaped by the commercial concerns of the company and the modern Western notions of what constituted progress. He was inevitably critical of the lifestyles of forest dwellers and felt that forests had to be turned into agricultural. Page number 274, Source 3, Buchanan on the Santhals. Buchanan wrote, "They are very clever in clearing new lands, but leave meanly. Their herds have no fence, and the walls are made of small sticks placed upright, close together, and plastered within with clay. They are small and slovenly and too flat roofed with very little arch. Source 4. The Rocks near Kaduya. Buchanan's journal is packed with observations like the following. About a mile farther on, I came to a low ledge of rocks without any evident strata. It is a small grained granite with reddish feldspar, with quartz and black mica. More than half a mile from thence, I came to another rock not stratified, and consisting of very fine grained granite with yellowish feldspar, whitish quartz, and black mica. 3. A revolt in the countryside, the Bombay Deccan. You have read about how the lives of peasants and zamindars of colonial Bengal and the Paharias and Santals of the Rajmahal Hills were changing. Now let us move across to Western India and to a later period and explore what was happening in the countryside in the Bombay Deccan. One way of exploring such changes is by focusing on a peasant revolt. In such climatic times, rebels express their anger and fury. They rise against what they perceive to be injustice and the causes of their suffering. If we try to understand the premises of their resentment and peel the layers of their anger, we get a glimpse of their life and experience that is otherwise hidden from us. Revolts also produce records that historians can look at. Alarmed by the actions of rebels and keen on restoring order, state authorities do not simply repress a rebellion. They try and understand it, inquire into its causes so that policies can be formulated and peace established. These inquiries produce evidence that historians can explore. Page number 275, source 5, on clearance and settled cultivation. Passing through one village in the lower Rajmahal Hills, Buchanan wrote, "The view of the country is exceedingly fine. The cultivation, especially the narrow valleys of rice winding in all directions, the cleared lands with the scattered trees, and the rocky hills are in perfection. All that is wanted is some appearance of progress in the area and a vastly extended and improved cultivation, of which the country is highly susceptible. Plantations of asan and palas for Tesar silkworms, and lac should occupy the place of woods to as great an extent as the demand will admit. The remainder might be all cleared and the greater part cultivated, while what is not fit for the purpose might rear Palmyra, that is Palmyra, and Mova, that is Mahua." Through the 19th century, peasants in various parts of India rose in revolt against moneylenders and grain dealers. One such revolt occurred in 1875 in the Deccan. 3.1 Account books are burnt. The movement began at Swipa, a large village in Pune, present-day Pune district. It was a market center where many shopkeepers and moneylenders lived. On 12th May 1875, riots from surrounding rural areas gathered and attacked the shopkeepers, demanding their bahi khatas, account books, and debt bonds. They burned the khatas, looted grain shops, and in some cases set fire to the houses of sahukars. From Pune, the revolt spread to Ahmednagar. Then over the next 2 months, it spread even further over an area of 6,500 square kilometers. More than 30 villages were affected. Everywhere the pattern was the same. Sahukars were attacked, account books burned, and debt bonds destroyed. Terrified of peasant attacks, the Sahukars fled the villages, very often leaving their property and belongings behind. As the revolt spread, British officials saw the spectre of 1857. Police posts were established in villages to frighten rebellious peasants into submission. Troops were quickly called in. 951 people were arrested and many convicted. But it took several months to bring the countryside under control. Page number 276. Source 6. On that day in Supa. On 16th May 1875, the district magistrate of Pune wrote to the police commissioner, "On arrival at Supa on Saturday 15th May, I learned of the disturbance. One house of a moneylender was burned down. About a dozen were forcibly broken into and completely gutted of their content. Account papers, bonds, grains, country clothes were burnt in the street, where heaps of ashes are still to be seen. The chief constable apprehended 50 persons. Stolen property worth rupees 2,000 was recovered. The estimated loss is over rupees 25,000. Moneylenders claim it is over 1 lakh. Deccan Riots Commission." Source 7. A newspaper report. The following report, titled "The Riot and the Moneylender," appeared in the Native Opinion, 6th June 1876, and was quoted in report of the native newspapers of Bombay. They, the riots, first place spies on the boundaries of their villages to see if any government officers come and to give timely intimation of their arrival to the offenders. They then assemble in a body and go to the houses of their creditors and demand from them a surrender of their bonds and other documents, and threaten them in case of refusal with assault and plunder. If any government officer happens to approach the villages where the above is taking place, the spies give intimation to the offenders and the latter disperse in time. Why the burning of bonds and deeds? Why this revolt? What does it tell us about the Deccan countryside and about agrarian changes under colonial rule? Let us look at this longer history of changes over the 19th century. 3.2. A new revenue system. As British rule expanded from Bengal to other parts of India, new systems of revenue were imposed. The permanent settlement was rarely extended to any region beyond Bengal. Why was this so? One reason was that after 1810, agricultural prices rose, increasing the value of harvest produce and enlarging the income of the Bengal zamindars. Since the revenue demand was fixed under the permanent settlement, the colonial state could not claim any share of this enhanced income. Keen on expanding its financial resources, the colonial government had to think of ways to maximize its land revenue. So, in territories annexed in the 19th century, temporary revenue settlements were made. There were other reasons too. When officials devise policies, their thinking is deeply shaped by economic theories they are familiar with. By the 1820s, the economist David Ricardo was a celebrated figure in England. Colonial officials had learnt Ricardian ideas during their college years. In Maharashtra, when British officials set about formulating the terms of the early settlement in the 1820s, they operated with some of these ideas. According to Ricardian ideas, a landowner should have a claim only to the average rent that prevailed at a given time. When the land yielded more than this average rent, the landowner has a surplus that the state needed to tax. If tax was not levied, cultivators were likely to turn into rentiers, and their surplus income was unlikely to be productively invested in the improvement of the land. Many British officials in India thought that the history of Bengal confirmed Ricardo's theory. There, the zamindars seem to have turned into rentiers, leasing out land and living on the rental incomes. It was therefore necessary, the British officials now felt, to have a different system. The revenue system that was introduced in the Bombay Deccan came to be known as the Ryotwari system. The Ryotwari settlement. Unlike the Bengal system, the revenue was directly settled with the Ryot. The average income from different types of soil was estimated, the revenue paying capacity of the Ryot was assessed, and a proportion of it fixed as the share of the state. The lands were resurveyed every 30 years and the revenue rates increased. Therefore, the revenue demand was no longer permanent. 3.3 Revenue demand and peasant debt. The first revenue settlement in the Bombay Deccan was made in the 1820s. The revenue that was demanded was so high that in many places peasants deserted their villages and migrated to new regions. In areas of poor soil and fluctuating rainfall, the problem was particularly acute. When rains failed and harvests were poor, peasants found it impossible to pay the revenue. However, the collectors in charge of revenue collection were keen on demonstrating their efficiency and pleasing their superiors. So they went about extracting payment with utmost severity. When someone failed to pay, his crops were seized and a fine was imposed on the whole village. By the 1830s, the problem became more severe. Prices of agricultural products fell sharply after 1832 and did not recover for over a decade and a half. This meant a further decline in peasants' income. At the same time, the countryside was devastated by a famine that struck in the years 1832-34. 1/3 of the cattle of the Deccan were killed, and half the human population died. Those who survived had no agricultural stocks to see them through the crisis. Unpaid balances of revenue mounted. How did cultivators live through such years? How did they pay the revenue, procure their consumption needs, purchase their plugs and cattle, or get their children married? Inevitably, they borrowed. Revenue could rarely be paid without a loan from a moneylender. But once a loan was taken, the Ryot found it difficult to pay it back. As debt mounted and loans remained unpaid, peasants' dependence on moneylenders increased. They now needed loans even to buy their everyday needs and meet their production expenditure. By the 1840s, officials were finding evidence of alarming levels of peasant indebtedness everywhere. By the mid-1840s, there were signs of an economic recovery of sorts. Many British officials had begun to realize that the settlements of the 1820s had been harsh. The revenue demanded was exorbitant, the system rigid, and the peasant economy on the verge of collapse. So the revenue demand was moderated to encourage peasants to expand cultivation. After 1845, agricultural prices recovered steadily. Cultivators were now extending their acreage, moving into new areas, and transforming pasture lands into cultivated fields. But to expand cultivation, peasants needed more plugs and cattle. They needed money to buy seeds and land. For all these, they had to turn once again to moneylenders. 3.4 Then came the cotton boom. Before the 1860s, 3/4 of the raw cotton imports into Britain came from America. British cotton manufacturers had for long been worried about this dependence on American supplies. What would happen if this source was cut off? Troubled by this question, they eagerly looked for alternative sources of supply. In 1857, the Cotton Supply Association was founded in Britain, and in 1859, the Manchester Cotton Company was formed. Their objective was to encourage cotton production in every part of the world suited for its growth. India was seen as a country that could supply cotton to Lancashire if the America supply dried up. It possessed suitable soil, a climate favorable to cotton cultivation, and cheap labor. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, a wave of panic spread through cotton circles in Britain. Raw cotton imports from America fell to less than 3% of the normal, from over 2 million bales of 400 ibs each in 1861 to 55,000 bales in 1862. Frantic messages were sent to India and elsewhere to increase cotton exports to Britain. In Bombay, cotton merchants visited the cotton districts to assess supplies and encourage cultivation. As cotton prices soared, export merchants in Bombay were keen to secure as much cotton as possible to meet the British demand. So they gave advances to urban sahukars, who in turn extended credit to those rural moneylenders who promised to secure the produce. When there is a boom in the market, credit flows easily, for those who give out loans feel secure about recovering their money. These developments had a profound impact on the Deccan countryside. The ryots in the Deccan villages suddenly found access to seemingly limitless credit. They were being given rupees 100 as advance for every acre they planted with cotton. Sahukars were more than willing to extend long-term loans. While the American crisis continued, cotton production in Bombay, Deccan expanded. Between 1860 and 1864, cotton acreage doubled. By 1862, over 90% of cotton imports into Britain were coming from India. But these boom years did not bring prosperity to all cotton producers. Some rich peasants did gain, but for the large majority, cotton expansions meant heavier debt. 3.5 Credit dries up. While the boom lasted, cotton merchants in India had visions of capturing the world market in raw cotton, permanently displacing America. The editor of the Bombay Gazette had asked in 1861, what can prevent India from supplanting the slave states of USA as the feeder of Lancashire? By 1865, these dreams were over. As the Civil War ended, cotton production in America revived and Indian cotton exports to Britain steadily declined. Export merchants and sahukars in Maharashtra were no longer keen on extending long-term credit. They could see the demand for Indian cotton fall and cotton prices slide downwards. So they decided to close down their operations, restrict their advances to peasants, and demand repayment of outstanding debts. While credit dried up, the revenue demand increased. The first revenue settlement, as we have seen, was in the 1820s and 1830s. Now it was time for the next. And in the new settlement, the demand was increased dramatically, from 50 to 100%. How could ryots pay this inflated demand at a time when prices were falling and cotton fields disappearing? Yet again, they had to turn to the moneylender. But the moneylender now refused loans. He no longer had confidence in the ryots' capacity to repay. 3.6 The experience of injustice. The refusal of moneylenders to extend loans enraged the ryots. What infuriated them was not simply that they had got deeper and deeper into debt or that they were utterly dependent on the moneylender for survival, but that moneylenders were being insensitive to their plight. The moneylenders were violating the customary norms of the countryside. Moneylending was certainly widespread before colonial rule, and moneylenders were often powerful figures. Page number 282. Source 8. A ryot petitions. This is an example of a petition from a ryot of the village of Mirajgaon, Taluka Karjat, to the collector Ahmednagar, Deccan Ryots Commission. The sahukars, have of late begun to oppress us. As we cannot earn enough to defray our household expenses, we are actually forced to beg of them to provide us with money, clothes, and grain, which we obtain from them not without great difficulty, nor without their compelling us to enter into hard conditions in the bond. Moreover, the necessary clothes and grain are not sold to us at cash rates. The prices asked from us are generally 25 or 50% more than demanded from customers making ready money payments. The produce of our fills is also taken by the saukars, who at the time of removing it assure us that it will be credited to our account, but they did not actually make any mention of it in the accounts. They also refused to pass us any receipts for the produce so removed by them. A variety of customary norms regulated the relationship between the moneylender and the riot. One general norm was that the interest charged could not be more than the principal. This was meant to limit the moneylender's exactions and define what could be counted as fair interest. Under colonial rule, this norm broke down. In one of the many cases investigated by the Deccan Riots Commission, the moneylender had charged over rupees 2000 as interest on a loan of rupees 100. In petition after petition, riots complained of the injustice of such exactions and the violation of custom. The riots came to see the moneylender as devious and deceitful. They complained of moneylenders manipulating laws and forging accounts. In 1859, the British passed a limitation law that stated that the loan bonds signed between moneylenders and riots would have validity for only 3 years. This law was meant to check the accumulation of interest over time. Page number 283. Source 9. Deeds of hire. When debts mounted, the peasant was unable to pay back the loan to the moneylender. He had no option but to give over all his possessions, land, carts, and animals to the moneylender. But without animals, he could not continue to cultivate. So he took land on rent and animals on hire. He now had to pay for the animals which had originally belonged to him. He had to sign a deed of hire stating very clearly that these animals and carts did not belong to him. In cases of conflict, these deeds could be enforced through the court. The following is the text of a deed that a peasant signed in November 1873 from the records of the Deccan Riots Commission. I have sold to you on account of the debt due to you my 2 carriages having iron axles with their appurtenances and 4 bullocks. I have taken from you on hire under this deed this very same 2 carriages and 4 bullocks. I shall pay every month the hire thereof at rupees 4 a month and obtain a receipt in your own handwriting. In the absence of a receipt, I shall not contend that the hire had been paid. The moneylender, however, turned the law around, forcing the riot to sign a new bond every 3 years. When a new bond was signed, the unpaid balance, that is the original loan and the accumulated interest, was entered as a principal on which a new set of interest charges was calculated. In petitions that the Deccan Riots Commission collected, riots described how this process worked and how moneylenders used a variety of other means to shortchange the riot. They refused to give receipts when loans were repaid, entered fictitious figures in bonds, acquired the peasants' harvest at low prices, and ultimately took over peasants' property. Deeds and bonds appeared as symbols of the new oppressive system. In the past, such deeds had been rare. The British, however, were suspicious of transactions based on informal understanding, as was common in the past. The terms of transactions, they believed, had to be clearly, unambiguously, and categorically stated in contracts, deeds, and bonds and regulated by law. Unless the deed or contract was legally enforceable, it had no value. Over time, peasants came to associate the misery of their lives with the new regime of bonds and deeds. They were made to sign and put thumb impressions on documents, but they did not know what they were actually signing. They had no idea of the clauses that moneylenders inserted in the bonds. They feared the written word. But they had no choice because to survive they needed loans, and moneylenders were unwilling to give loans without legal bonds. Page number 284, Source 10. How debts mounted. In a petition to the Deccan Riots Commission, a Riot explained how the system of loans worked. A saukar lends his debt ₹100 on bond at ₹3 to 2 annas per cent per mensem. The latter agrees to pay the amount within 8 days from the passing of the bond. 3 years after the stipulated time for repaying the amount, the saukar takes from his debtor another bond for the principal and interest together at the same rate of interest, and allows him 125 days time to liquidate the debt. After the lapse of 3 years and 15 days, a third bond is passed by the debtor. This process is repeated. At the end of 12 years, his interest on ₹1,000 amounts to ₹2,028, 10 annas, 3 paise. 4. The Deccan Riots Commission. When the revolt spread in the Deccan, the government of Bombay was initially unwilling to see it as anything serious. But the government of India, worried by the memory of 1857, pressurized the government of Bombay to set up a commission of inquiry to investigate into the causes of the riots. The commission produced a report that was presented to the British Parliament in 1878. This report, referred to as the Deccan Riots Report, provides historians with a range of sources for the study of the riot. The commission held inquiries in the districts where the riots spread, recorded statements of riots, sahukars, and eyewitnesses, compiled statistical data on revenue rates, prices, and interest rates in different regions, and collated the reports sent by district collectors. In looking at such sources, we have to again remember that they are official sources and reflect official concerns and interpretations of events. The Deccan Riots Commission, for instance, was specifically asked to judge whether the level of government revenue demand was the cause of the revolt. And after presenting all the evidence, the commission reported that the government demand was not the cause of peasant anger. It was the moneylenders who were to blame. This argument is found very frequently in colonial records. This shows that there was a persistent reluctance on the part of the colonial government to admit that popular discontent was ever on account of government action. This shows that there was a persistent reluctance on the part of the colonial government to admit that popular discontent was ever on account of government action. Official reports, thus, are invaluable sources for the reconstruction of history. But they have to be always read with care and juxtaposed with evidence culled from newspapers, unofficial accounts, legal records, and where possible, oral sources.